The wind slowly swept across the main street of that small town in the American Midwest, carrying dust, dry leaves, and an uncomfortable, almost oppressive silence. The old buildings, with their faded facades and dusty windows, seemed to observe everything in silence, like weary witnesses to stories that were never told. The sky, tinged with cold shades of gray and faded orange, heralded the end of another ordinary day. Ordinary for everyone, except for the man who walked alone along the cracked sidewalk. His name was Daniel Walker. Daniel Walker was a veteran of American wars. But there, in that late afternoon, no one saw him that way. To the hurried eyes of the city, he was just a strange man, scarred, out of place. A man who didn't fit in. His steps were slow, firm, controlled, as if each movement needed to be authorized by something invisible within him. His body still obeyed a discipline that civilian life had never demanded, but that war had never allowed him to forget. The scars drew attention even before he looked at them. Old cuts crisscrossed his arms, climbed up his neck, marking Daniel Walker's face with irregular, deep lines, impossible to ignore. They weren't discreet marks. They were scars that spoke, even when he remained silent. To someone who had never been near a battlefield, those marks seemed exaggerated, almost disturbing. To Daniel, they were simply memories etched on his skin. As she walked, she felt the stares, some quick, uncomfortable, others too long, laden with judgment. There were whispers, stifled laughter, low comments that pierced the air like blades. No one asked where those scars came from. No one was interested in the story behind them. In that small town, it was easier to label than to understand. Daniel Walker, the war veteran, didn't react. He didn't turn his face away. He didn't quicken his pace. He had learned long ago that reacting wasn't always about surviving. On the battlefield, silence meant life. On that quiet street, silence meant enduring. He kept his gaze ahead, alert, as if he were still on patrol. The habit had never left him. The distant sound of a car passing slowly mingled with the creaking of a loose sign hanging in a closed shop. An American flag fluttered in front of a public building a few meters away, its slow movements contrasting with the weight that image carried for Daniel. He had served under that flag. He had bled for it. He had lost friends for it. Yet he passed beneath it as if invisible. As he passed an old shop window, Daniel saw his distorted reflection in the glass. He paused for a brief moment. He observed the man staring back at him. The clothes were simple, dark, worn from continuous use. The face was hardened not by anger but by resistance, and the eyes betrayed everything. The eyes of a war veteran who had seen too much. Things that cannot be explained, things that one carries forever. A laugh echoed behind him, young, cruel in its nonchalance. Comments crossed the air, quick, venomous. Someone mentioned the scars. Someone insinuated things they didn't know. Daniel Walker took a deep breath. His chest tightened for a second, an old, automatic reflex. He held back. He always held back. That city had no idea of the kind of control that required. The sky darkened slowly, as if keeping pace with his thoughts. Daniel sensed something in the air. He always did. The war had taught him to recognize signs before they became obvious. There was a strange tension in that late afternoon. An unsettling feeling that this wouldn't just be another lonely night. Something was forming. Something was about to break the silent routine of that city and his own. The war veteran continued walking. The narrow sidewalks, the old lampposts, the lined-up houses seemed to form a silent corridor around him. He felt the stares on his back, felt the weight of judgment, felt the silent humiliation of being reduced to his scars. To them, Daniel Walker was just a man too scarred. To himself, he was someone who carried a past too heavy to share. He wasn't seeking recognition, he never had. The war veteran only wanted peace, a place where he could exist without having to explain himself. But the truth has its own weight, and when it begins to emerge, no one can stop it. Those scars, the object of scorn and mockery, were silent proof of courage, sacrifice, and survival. As Daniel Walker walked away down the main street, small against the backdrop of the old buildings, one certainty became clear, even if still invisible to everyone around him. That man, humiliated by his scars, was a war veteran. And very soon, that city would learn that some scars don't diminish a man. They reveal exactly who he is. Daniel Walker lived on the fringes of that small town. Like someone who had learned to occupy little space, even when his presence drew too much attention. His tiny apartment was above an old, disused mechanic's workshop, in an old building that creaked at night, as if complaining of its own weariness. The place was simple, almost austere. Old furniture, few personal belongings, bare walls. There were no family photos scattered around, nor mementos proudly displayed. Everything that truly mattered to Daniel was kept stored away. Some things in a metal box at the back of the closet, others buried in places no one else could reach. Daniel Walker, a war veteran, followed a rigid, almost military pattern, even years after leaving the battlefield. He always woke before dawn, long before the rest of the city came alive. The silence of the early hours of the day was the only time he felt any control. He prepared coffee with precise, restrained movements, as if he were still under observation. Every gesture was functional. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was excessive. He worked temporary jobs, always far from busy places. Simple repairs, maintenance, small manual tasks that didn't require conversation, just execution. The city knew him just enough to know that he did odd jobs. Nobody asked many questions. Daniel didn't offer explanations either. The war had taught him that the less you say, the less you lose. Despite this, he felt the constant weight of not belonging. People greeted him cautiously when they greeted him at all. Some looked away, others stared too intently. Daniel noticed everything. He always noticed. His hyper-awareness never left him. In any environment, he instinctively positioned himself with his back to the wall, attentive to exits, sounds, and movements around him. It was as if his body was still trapped in a state of permanent alert, even when the threat no longer existed. Aviso: Daniel, veterano de guerra. Homem branco de 45 anos, cabelos pretos e olhos cor de mel escuro, veste roupas simples e discretas em tons escuros, jaqueta funcional de estilo militar e jeans gasto. Rosto marcado por cicatrizes sutis, traços firmes, postura rígida e olhar profundo típico de um veterano de guerra. Filha, mulher branca de 32 anos, cabelos loiros e olhos azul escuro, usa roupas casuais em tons claros ou neutros, casaco leve ou vestido simples, rosto delicado e expressivo, olhar empático, postura aberta e presença serena. The nights were the worst. When the city noise subsided and the world seemed to slow down, thoughts took over. Daniel would lie on the hard bed, stare at the darkened ceiling, and wait for sleep to come, something that rarely happened without resistance. Sometimes he would wake up with a racing heart, a sweaty body, and clenched fists. Other times, he wouldn't even fall asleep. He would simply relive it. Distant sounds would transform into echoes of the past. A door slamming could be enough to bring him back to places he preferred to forget. Daniel Walker didn't talk about it. In that small town, talking about war seemed too distant, almost abstract. For him, it was present, constant, invisible to everyone else, but too heavy to ignore. The scars on his body were only the visible part of something much bigger. The true marks were hidden, shaping his reactions, his fears, his difficulty in trusting. He avoided attachments. Long conversations made him uncomfortable. Personal questions were quickly dismissed with short answers. It wasn't rudeness, it was self-preservation. The war had taught him that attachment is costly. Still, there were times when loneliness weighed more than any painful memory. On some nights, Daniel would sit on the small balcony of his apartment, watching the empty street, trying to convince himself that this isolation was a choice, not a consequence. The city moved at its slow, almost predictable pace. Community parties, casual encounters, dinners among neighbors. Daniel rarely participated. When he did show up, he felt out of place, as if he were watching life from the outside. The loud laughter, the carefree gestures, the ease with which people connected. It all seemed to belong to another world. A world he had left behind when he first put on his uniform. Even so, there were small rituals that kept him balanced. Long walks at dusk, Physical exercises done in silence. Meticulous care of simple objects. It was his way of keeping his mind occupied, of preventing the past from taking up all the space. Daniel Walker, a war veteran, knew that stopping meant remembering too much. Despite his reserved appearance, there was humanity in his simplest gestures. He helped when he could, without fanfare. He fixed something broken, solved a problem, and disappeared before anyone could thank him. He didn't seek recognition. The war had taught him that doing what needs to be done is more important than being seen doing it. Still, something inside him remained restless. A silent emptiness, difficult to name. Daniel felt his life was suspended, as if he were merely existing between a past that wouldn't let him go and a future he couldn't imagine. The small town seemed comfortable for everyone, except him. Every quiet street, every casual smile reinforced the feeling that he carried something that no one there would truly understand. Daniel Walker, a war veteran, carried on as he always had. One day at a time, maintaining a firm posture, a watchful gaze, and a protected heart. But without even realizing it, that solitary routine was about to be interrupted. Because sometimes life finds a way to break through even the best trained defenses. And when that happens, not even a war veteran can remain untouched. Before he was known as a war veteran, before his eyes carried the weight of everything he had lived through, Daniel Walker was just Daniel. An ordinary boy growing up in a small town in the American Midwest, in a place where mornings started early, people knew each other by name, and the future seemed to follow preordained paths. His childhood was marked by simplicity, discipline, and a constant sense of belonging that he would later discover how rare it was. Daniel grew up in a modest home, surrounded by ancient trees and quiet streets. His father worked hard, believing that character is built through responsibility and example. His mother was the anchor, the one who kept the home alive even on difficult days. From an early age, Daniel learned the value of a given word, of silent effort, and the idea that protecting those you love is more important than any external recognition. These principles became a part of him long before any uniform or battlefield. At school, Daniel wasn't the most popular nor the most problematic. He was observant, reserved, but always willing to help. He enjoyed sports, crafts, any activity that required focus and discipline. He had an almost instinctive need to be useful, to feel that he made a difference. The teachers said he had something different, a precocious maturity, as if he carried responsibilities greater than his age suggested. As a teenager, Daniel Walker began to feel the weight of expectations. The small town offered few clear paths. Many of his friends talked about leaving, others about staying and repeating what they already knew. Daniel felt a growing restlessness. He wanted more than predictability. He wanted purpose. He wanted something that would give meaning to that constant urge to protect, to serve, to be ready when needed. It was during this period that military service began to emerge as a real possibility. Not as an impulsive act, but as a decision that had matured slowly. Daniel didn't romanticize war. He understood the risk, the sacrifice, the possibility of not returning the same, or of not returning at all. Still, there was something about that choice that made sense to him. Serving meant belonging to something bigger. It meant honoring values he had carried since childhood. Saying goodbye to his family wasn't easy. His mother tried to hide her fear behind restrained smiles. His father, proud and silent, squeezed his hand tightly, as if transferring everything he couldn't put into words. Daniel promised to return. He didn't promise to be the same, just to return. At that moment, he still had no idea how heavy that promise would be. Before the war, Daniel Walker dreamed of simple things. He thought about building a stable life, perhaps a family, a house of his own. He liked the idea of routine, of waking up early, of feeling that the day had a clear purpose. He had a genuine, almost naive hope that effort would always be rewarded. The world still seemed like a comprehensible place, with clear rules and defined limits. Military training quickly molded that young man into something more rigid, more restrained. Daniel adapted well. Discipline, order, hierarchy, all of that resonated with who he already was inside. The instructors saw him as someone reliable, someone who didn't break under pressure. What no one realized was that Daniel wasn't just learning techniques. He was learning to silence parts of himself. Before the battlefield, Daniel would still write long letters, full of everyday details. He talked about the weather, training, small victories. He tried to reassure those at home, minimizing risks, avoiding words that could generate fear. He believed he was protecting his family by hiding the reality. In fact, the habit of keeping everything to himself began there, a habit that would become permanent. There was also the emotional side that Daniel never knew how to express well. Relationships had always been difficult for him, not for lack of feeling, but for excessive caution. Before the war, he already had difficulty allowing himself to depend on someone. The idea of love came accompanied by the fear of loss, even before he knew what loss really meant. When he finally set off on his first mission, Daniel Walker carried with him everything he had learned up to that point: solid values, quiet hope, and the conviction that he was doing the right thing. He didn't imagine that that version of himself, the Daniel from before the war, would be forever frozen in that moment of departure. Because the battlefield doesn't just transform the body, it redefines memories, shatters certainties, and reconstructs identities. The man who would return years later would still be called Daniel Walker, a war veteran. But the boy who left that small town, full of simple dreams and belief in the future, would never return the same way. Daniel Walker ceased to be just Daniel the moment he truly stepped onto the battlefield. It wasn't with the first shot, nor the first order received over the radio. It was in the silence that followed. A heavy silence, broken only by held breaths and the distant sound of something he couldn't yet name. Fear. There, in that moment suspended between expectation and reality, Daniel was no longer just a soldier. He was beginning to become a war veteran, even without understanding the cost of it. The battlefield did not present itself as the training had taught. There were no clear lines between right and wrong, safety and danger. Everything was blurry, unpredictable. Daniel, now a war veteran in forced training, quickly learned that constant vigilance was the only way to survive. Sleep little, trust even less. Every step required calculation. Every decision could mean life or death, not only his, but also that of the men who had come to depend on him silently. The first losses came too soon. Names he had just learned now existed only as echoes. Daniel never forgot the sound of the voices that disappeared, nor the feeling of helplessness that settled in afterward. As a war veteran, he would learn that there is no emotional preparation for seeing someone fall beside you and continuing to move forward. The body moves, the mind obeys, but something inside breaks without making a sound. Over time, Daniel Walker developed what many war veterans recognize: the ability to function despite the chaos. He carried out orders, protected positions, maintained outward calm while inside everything screamed. It wasn't courage in the romantic sense. It was necessity. It was survival. Each mission left invisible marks, accumulated like layers that no one at home would ever see. The nights were the worst. Even when he rested, his sleep was fragmented. Distant sounds turned into alerts. Daniel's mind, a war veteran still too young to bear so much, refused to shut down. He relived moments in disconnected flashes, glances, quick decisions, seconds that seemed to stretch on forever. There was no explicit bloodshed in these memories, only the weight of choices made under extreme pressure. One of the moments that marked him most happened during a seemingly simple mission. Nothing extraordinary, nothing that justified the impact it would have later. A minor mistake, incomplete information, and everything changed in a matter of seconds. Daniel did what needed to be done. He saved those within reach, but he lost someone he had promised to protect. For a war veteran, promises like that are never forgotten, even when they were never spoken aloud. Guilt crept in slowly, not as a shock, but as something persistent, almost routine. Daniel began to wonder if he could have done things differently, if a decision made half a second earlier would have altered the outcome. These questions had no answer, but they repeated themselves tirelessly. Every war veteran carries at least one of these unanswered questions. As the months passed, Daniel Walker no longer counted time as before. Dates lost their meaning. What mattered was only the next move, the next order, the next dawn. He became more withdrawn, more economical with words. The letters home became shorter, fewer details, less emotion. Not because he didn't feel, but because he no longer knew how to explain. The psychological impact didn't just come from direct combat. It came from impossible moral decisions, from situations where there was no right choice. As a war veteran, Daniel learned that the line between hero and survivor is thin and cruel. Often, surviving meant bearing consequences that no one taught him how to process. When he finally left the battlefield, Daniel Walker emerged physically whole, but internally fragmented. He knew he had survived, but he didn't know exactly at what cost. He officially became a war veteran, with medals, records, and formal recognition. But no one handed him a manual for dealing with what came next. The marks of the battlefield weren't visible scars, but involuntary reactions, prolonged silences. A gaze that was always too attentive. Daniel no longer reacted to the world as before. He had learned to anticipate dangers where they no longer existed. And even far from the war never truly seemed far from him. For Daniel, a war veteran, the trauma wasn't an isolated event. It was an accumulation, a sum of moments that seeped into his identity. He didn't talk about it, he didn't know how, but each unresolved memory became part of who he was, shaping the man who would one day return to that small town, carrying an entire battlefield within his heart. Daniel Walker's return to civilian life was marked by a routine far too predictable for someone who had spent years living under constant alert. As a war veteran, he had learned to distrust excessive calm, yet his days almost always followed the same script. Waking up early, overly strong coffee, silent walks through a small town in the American Midwest, temporary jobs that demanded more from his body than his mind. Nothing seemed capable of breaking that fragile balance, until the day the past decided to knock on his door unexpectedly. The event that called for didn't come as an explosion or immediate tragedy. It came discreetly, almost banally, like so many things that change an entire life without warning. Daniel, a war veteran accustomed to noticing details that others ignored, sensed that something was wrong even before he understood why. It was on a cloudy afternoon, when the sky seemed too heavy for the season, that he entered the small town market to buy his usual things. There, between narrow shelves and trivial conversations, he heard an argument. Raised voices, laden with contempt. A group of men surrounded someone near the exit. Daniel didn't see the face immediately, but he recognized the tone. As a war veteran, he knew that kind of aggression well, not physical yet, but about to cross that line. Daniel's body reacted before his mind. His muscles tensed, his breathing changed. When he finally took in the whole scene, something inside him clenched. The person being humiliated was a woman, younger, visibly shaken, trying to maintain her dignity while being accused of something she didn't seem to fully understand. The market owner watched in silence, unable or reluctant to intervene. For Daniel Walker, a war veteran who spent years protecting civilians in extreme situations, that inaction was almost unbearable. He tried to pull away, truly. The war veteran within him knew that interfering meant opening doors he had been painstakingly keeping closed. It meant drawing attention. It meant, perhaps, reviving parts of himself he preferred to keep dormant. But there was something in that woman's gaze, a mixture of fear and resistance, that awakened something Daniel couldn't ignore. The decisive moment was simple. One of the men pushed the woman hard enough to make her lose her balance. The sound of the impact echoed too loudly in that small space. Daniel felt the inner jolt, the same one that usually preceded irreversible decisions on the battlefield. He advanced. The intervention was calm, almost restrained. Daniel didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply placed himself between them. His posture was rigid, his gaze firm, his silence laden with authority. Years of war had taught the veteran that sometimes presence was more powerful than any word. The men hesitated. Something about that stranger made them recoil, even without fully understanding why. The words that followed were few, but definitive. Daniel asked them to step aside. not as a request, but as a statement of fact. There were provocations, nervous laughter, comments about him not meddling where he wasn't wanted. But the war veteran didn't budge. He didn't blink. And little by little, one by one, they gave up. When it was all over, silence returned to the room. The woman thanked him, still trembling. Daniel responded with a brief nod, ready to leave before any further conversation could develop. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way she looked at him, not as a hero, but as someone who too was carrying something heavy. Before he could leave, the market owner commented, almost without thinking, something that changed the course of that afternoon. He mentioned aloud Daniel's military past, not with the intention of exposing him, but as a belated justification for the authority he had demonstrated. The words, war veteran, echoed through the space differently, laden with a weight that Daniel felt immediately. The looks shifted. Curiosity replaced hostility. Daniel realized in that instant that something had been triggered, not just in that woman, but in the city. The label he had been avoiding was now in the air, too visible to ignore. And with it came expectations, judgments, and stories he couldn't control. The event didn't end there. Hours later, back home, Daniel Walker found a simple envelope slipped under the door. Inside was a short, handwritten note, thanking him again for his help. The signature was just a first name, but there was something more, a discreet request for a conversation, for help. Not immediate, not urgent, but sincere. For a war veteran who had been avoiding commitment, that piece of paper felt heavier than it should have. He sat, holding the note for a long time, in the dark, feeling the inner conflict grow. Fulfilling that request meant getting involved. It meant opening himself up to someone who could see parts of him that even he didn't fully understand. But it also meant something that war veteran Daniel Walker knew intimately: responding when someone needs help, even outside the battlefield, even when the danger isn't visible, even when the threat is emotional, silent, persistent. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't memories of the war that kept him awake, but the certainty that something new had begun. The calling event had served its purpose. The routine was broken. The past had connected with the present, and the war veteran, who had tried so hard to stay on the sidelines, was now facing a choice that would define the next chapter of his life. Daniel Walker spent the entire night battling his own conscience. As a war veteran, he knew this kind of silent battle well, the kind fought far from explosions and shouted orders, but equally exhausting. The note lay on the simple kitchen table, folded with excessive care, as if it were something too fragile to be handled carelessly. He observed it as one examines an old map, knowing that any decision made from there would lead him into uncharted territory. The war veteran's instinct told him not to get involved. Years on the battlefield had taught Daniel that creating bonds meant creating vulnerabilities. People become targets, emotions become weaknesses. He had survived in large part by learning when to walk away. But there was another part of him, quieter, more human, that refused to ignore such a direct, honest plea for help. The next morning, Daniel woke before sunrise. The habit had never left him. He put on his dark, military-style jacket, not out of nostalgia, but because it was practical, durable, familiar. The war veteran wasn't seeking emotional comfort in that clothing. He was seeking functionality, a minimal sense of control. Before leaving, he looked at the note again. He took a deep breath and decided to go. The meeting took place in a small city cafe, one of those where everyone knows each other by name. Daniel chose a table away from the wall, another relic of the battlefield. He arrived too early and observed the surroundings, attentive to every movement, even knowing there was no real threat there. Still, the war veteran within him never completely switched off. When she entered, he knew immediately that she was the woman from the market. There was something in her posture, in her restrained way of moving, that he recognized. Not as weakness, but as someone who had learned to endure more than she should. She approached cautiously, as if afraid of invading a space that didn't belong to her. Daniel stood up reflexively, a simple, respectful gesture. The conversation began timidly, measured words, frequent silences. Daniel Walker wasn't a man of speeches. As a war veteran, he had learned to listen more than to speak. And that's what he did. He let her explain her situation at her own pace, without interruptions, without judgment. She spoke about the pressure she had been under, about veiled threats, about feeling trapped in a city where everyone seemed to be watching, but few were helping. Daniel felt something stir within him. Not anger, not impulse, responsibility. On the battlefield, he had learned that protecting didn't mean attacking, but anticipating risks, creating exits, reducing damage. And that was exactly how he approached the situation. As a war veteran, he began asking practical, discreet questions that would help understand the scenario without exposing anyone. He didn't promise to solve everything. He didn't offer grandiose solutions. He simply committed to helping as much as possible. For Daniel Walker, that commitment carried real weight. In the past, promises meant lives. And even outside of war, he didn't make them lightly. The act of courage wasn't physical nor spectacular. It was emotional. It was allowing someone to get close. It was accepting that her skills, honed in war, still had value in the civilian world. Not to destroy, but to protect. Daniel accompanied the woman to various points in the city in the following days, not as a visible bodyguard, but as a constant, strategic presence. He observed, memorized patterns, identified suspicious behavior, all discreetly. There was a specific moment when the situation almost spiraled out of control. One of the men involved in the market incident tried to intimidate her again, this time in a more secluded location. Daniel was nearby, not by coincidence, but by calculation. As a war veteran, he knew that prevention was the most effective form of intervention. Daniel's approach was firm, but humane. He took a stand, making it clear that this woman was not alone. There were no explicit threats, just the truth. Daniel Walker's gaze carried the authority of someone who had already faced the worst and didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The conflict dissolved before it escalated. Later, when it was all over, Daniel felt the delayed impact. His hands trembled slightly. His breathing took a while to regulate. The war veteran recognized the signs, not of fear, but of emotional release. He stepped away for a few minutes, regaining control, as he had done so many times after difficult missions. That night, for the first time in a long time, Daniel Walker felt something different as he lay down. Not complete peace, but purpose. He realized that the act of courage he had performed wasn't just for her, it was for him too. By helping someone, he had reaffirmed a part of himself that the war had almost erased, the capacity to care. The war veteran still carried traumas, still struggled with inner shadows. But at that moment, it became clear that his scars defined him not only by what he had lost, but also by what he was still capable of offering. The act of humanity didn't heal him, but it opened a crack. And for Daniel Walker, that was already more than he believed possible. The real conflict didn't arrive abruptly. It approached like a long shadow at dusk, silent, inevitable. Daniel Walker, a war veteran accustomed to identifying threats before they became visible, sensed this shift in the air before a single word was spoken. The small town in the American Midwest seemed the same streets, the same faces, the same slow pace, but something had shifted. And he knew that when a seemingly stable structure begins to creak, it's because the pressure has already exceeded its limit. The help Daniel offered did not go unnoticed. In a city where stories spread faster than facts, the war veteran quickly became a topic of conversation. Some saw him as trustworthy, a quiet man who did what was right. Others, however, came to see him as a threat to the unwritten order that governed that place. An order based on ancient hierarchies, family influence, and convenient silences. The bigger conflict began when Daniel realized that the woman he was helping was at the center of something much deeper than simple intimidation. There were vested interests, people with local power, respected names who, in public, defended certain values, but behind the scenes acted in the opposite way. For a war veteran like Daniel Walker, this duplicity was familiar. He had already seen leaders speak of honor while sacrificing others for convenience. Tension intensified when Daniel received an unexpected visit. An older man, well-dressed, with a posture too confident for that simple setting, appeared at his door one quiet afternoon. He didn't present himself as a threat. On the contrary, he spoke politely, almost cordially, but each word carried an implicit warning. Daniel Walker, a war veteran, immediately recognized that approach. Psychological pressure disguised as advice. The man suggested that Daniel stay away. He said the situation wasn't his problem, that getting involved would only bring complications. He spoke about reputation, about the past, about how people like Daniel are never fully understood in small towns. He didn't mention the war directly, but the subtext was clear. He knew exactly who Daniel was. The internal conflict began to intensify there. The war veteran felt the old battle awaken. The struggle between retreating to preserve his own safety or advancing to protect someone vulnerable. On the battlefield, Daniel Walker had always advanced when necessary. But now the enemy wasn't wearing a uniform. There were no clear rules. There were no orders. The pressure mounted in the following days. Looks changed. Conversations ceased when he passed by. Small signs of hostility emerged. Tools out of place, anonymous messages, veiled insinuations. Nothing explicit enough to justify a direct reaction, but enough to wear him down. As a war veteran, Daniel recognized this strategy. Continuous, psychological attrition. The greater conflict, however, was not merely external. Inside Daniel Walker, something was slowly breaking. Memories of the war began to mix with the present. Seemingly mundane situations triggered disproportionate responses. The war veteran struggled to maintain control, to prevent the past from taking command of his actions. He constantly questioned himself. How far could he go? Was it worth risking his own stability? He had fought so hard to build a minimally functional routine. And now, everything seemed threatened. The temptation to disappear, to distance himself, to abandon that city as he had done with so many other places after the war, began to gain strength. The woman noticed the change in him. She saw the deeper weariness, the greater rigidity in his gestures. In a difficult conversation, she told him she would understand if he gave up, that she didn't want to be the cause of more pain. These words hit Daniel Walker brutally. As a war veteran, he had heard versions of this before. People trying to spare him, not knowing that the greatest burden would come precisely from leaving. The turning point in the larger conflict occurred when the situation escalated concretely. A serious incident that jeopardized not only the woman's reputation, but her actual safety. Daniel arrived too late to prevent the initial impact. There was no extreme violence, but there were irreversible consequences. Something that could not simply be ignored or resolved in silence. Faced with this situation, Daniel Walker found himself confronted with the most difficult decision since returning from the war. As a war veteran, he knew what it meant to enter a conflict without guarantees of victory. He knew the emotional cost. He knew he could lose what little balance he had gained. But he also knew that retreating now would mean carrying yet another failure, another what-if, to the endless list that already haunted him. The biggest conflict wasn't about confronting powerful people. It was about confronting his own identity. Daniel needed to decide whether he would continue living as someone who had survived the war, trying not to feel anything anymore, or whether he would accept that being a war veteran also meant carrying responsibility even when it hurts. That night, alone at home, Daniel Walker sat in the dark for hours. The war veteran analyzed every possible scenario, every consequence. He wasn't seeking heroism, he was seeking coherence. And deep down, he already knew the answer. The greater conflict wasn't about to happen. It was already underway, within him. And the next choice would define not only that woman's fate, but who Daniel Walker would allow himself to become from that point on. The breaking point didn't come as an explosion. It came as a silent, slow, inevitable collapse, exactly the way that most destroys a war veteran. Daniel Walker always believed he could recognize the limit before crossing it. On the battlefield, that ability saved lives. But off it, without clear lines, without visible enemies, the limit dissolves, without warning. It all began on a seemingly ordinary night. The small town was too quiet, the kind of silence that Daniel, a war veteran, had learned to fear. He was alone at home, sitting at the table, the light off. Only the faint glow of the street coming through the window. He wasn't thinking about anything specific, and that, for him, was already a warning sign. Mental emptiness was never rest. It was restraint. The recent incident still echoed within him, not because of its objective gravity, but because of what it represented. He had failed to anticipate it. He had underestimated how much the conflict had escalated. For a war veteran, this kind of failure is not just strategic, it's moral. Daniel Walker began to question himself with a harshness that no outsider could impose. His hands trembled slightly. His breath was too short. He tried to ignore it, as he had done so many times since returning from the war. But that night, his body wouldn't obey. A distant sound, perhaps just a passing truck, was enough to break the fragile barrier he had been maintaining. In seconds, the present dissolved. Daniel was no longer in that house. He was back on the battlefield. The smell, the weight of the equipment, the constant tension. The war veteran relived not a specific event, but a total feeling. Overwhelming responsibility, impossible decisions, irreversible loss. The images came fragmented, disordered, but emotionally intact. He tried to stand, but his legs gave way. He fell to his knees on the floor, panting. The war veteran who had learned to resist everything was now fighting something that could not be confronted with force. The voices returned, not as real sounds, but as vivid memories. Names, silent promises, looks he could never forget. The most devastating moment came when Daniel Walker realized the cruel parallel between past and present. He wasn't just reliving the war, he was reliving the same pattern, someone under his protection being put at risk, and him arriving too late to prevent the harm. For a war veteran, this repetition is an open wound. Guilt hit him hard. Not rational guilt, but the kind that corrodes, that seeps into every thought. Daniel began to wonder if the problem wasn't him, if his presence attracted conflict, if everything he touched ended up hurt. This kind of thinking is common among war veterans, but no less destructive for that. He struggled to his feet and went to the bathroom mirror. He turned on the light and stared at his own reflection. The man looking back at him seemed older than he actually was. The war veteran saw in his own face all the versions of himself that had survived and those that had not. It was there that the rift deepened. Daniel Walker finally verbalized something he had never said aloud. Perhaps he didn't deserve peace. Perhaps he was condemned to carry conflict wherever he went. Those words, even whispered, had an overwhelming weight. For a war veteran, accepting that idea is almost like giving up on oneself. The phone rang. The sound cut through the room like a blade. Daniel hesitated to answer, still trying to reconnect with the present. When he finally did, he heard her voice, trembling, restrained, clearly trying not to cry. She didn't ask for help. She only said she needed to hear him. That shattered something inside him. Daniel Walker, a war veteran trained to act under pressure, didn't know what to say for a few seconds. And those seconds were the hardest. He realized he was at the most vulnerable point of his entire journey. Not strong, not prepared, not whole, just human. After hanging up, Daniel sat back down on the floor, leaning against the wall. He wept silently. Not from utter despair, but from accumulated exhaustion. For a war veteran, crying isn't weakness, it's a release. It's the body trying to survive yet another invisible battle. That morning, Daniel Walker came closer to giving up than he would ever admit. He seriously considered leaving town, cutting ties, starting over somewhere else, as he had done so many times since leaving the war. The war veteran knew how to disappear. He was good at it. But something stopped him. It wasn't heroism, it was memory. He remembered who he had been before the war. He remembered why he joined the army. He remembered that, even wounded, even broken, he always believed in protecting, not because it was easy, but because it was right. The breaking point didn't heal him. It didn't bring immediate clarity. But it destroyed the last illusion Daniel Walker carried, that he could live on the sidelines, neutral, untouched. As a war veteran, he finally accepted that the war was over, but the responsibility of choosing who he would be afterward was still open. As the sun began to rise, Daniel was still awake. The war veteran watched the light slowly flood the room, feeling the weight of his recent collapse. He knew something had changed inside him, not for the better yet, but irreversibly. The breaking point had served its purpose. It had shattered Daniel Walker completely, so that perhaps something new could be rebuilt from the shards. Dawn found Daniel Walker in absolute silence, seated at the kitchen table, his hands firmly gripping a mug of now cold coffee. The collapse of the previous night still reverberated through his body, but something had rearranged itself inside. It wasn't calm, it wasn't relief, it was determination. A kind of hard clarity, all too familiar to any war veteran who has ever stood on the brink of giving up and continuing. Daniel didn't romanticize that moment. He knew there was no instant overcoming, no magical turnaround. But he also knew that, after recognizing his own rock bottom, only two options remained: stay there or climb back up, even if slowly. As a war veteran, he had learned that real progress is almost never grandiose. It's decided in silence, before any visible action. The climax began when he decided to stop reacting and started acting. Not driven by anger or impulse, but by conscious responsibility. Daniel Walker understood that protecting didn't just mean intervening at the critical moment. It meant exposing the truth, even when it came at a high price. And in that small town, the truth was the most dangerous thing anyone could carry. He sought out specific people, not formal authorities, but individuals who still retained some sense of justice. Difficult conversations took place in kitchens, garages, makeshift offices. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse without proof. He spoke like a war veteran accustomed to reporting facts, not emotions. He presented patterns, behaviors, connections that had previously been ignored for convenience. At the same time, he encouraged the woman not to hide anymore. He didn't expose her. He prepared her. As a war veteran, Daniel knew that facing something like this required emotional strategy as much as courage. He was by her side every step of the way, not as a savior, but as constant support, presence, stability, something he himself had rarely had. The decisive confrontation occurred when the city was forced to look at itself. There were no shouts, no violence. There was revelation. What was previously treated as rumor took concrete form. Respected people were questioned. Old silences became unbearable. For Daniel Walker, a war veteran, this was a different kind of battlefield, where the most powerful weapon was the truth spoken at the right moment. The pressure was intense. Attempts to disqualify him quickly arose. They questioned his past, his stability, his status as a war veteran. But for the first time, this didn't shake him. Daniel had already faced worse versions of himself in the lonely post-war nights. External judgment lost its power when he stopped running from internal judgment. The emotional climax occurred when Daniel needed to speak publicly, briefly, without dramatization. He didn't recount details of the war, nor did he seek compassion. He simply stated who he was, a war veteran who had survived extreme situations and who refused to watch another person be destroyed by collective silence. That simple statement had more impact than any elaborate speech. The woman, upon hearing him, realized something was changing within her as well. For the first time, she didn't feel alone. Not because someone was defending her, but because someone believed in her enough to stay. That, for both of them, was the true victory. The resolution didn't come as an exemplary punishment or total redemption for the city. It came as a shift. The power that previously hid behind appearances was weakened, fear lost ground. And above all, the cycle was broken. For Daniel Walker, a war veteran, this was already a victory. Internally, something also closed. Not completely. The scars remained. But the war veteran realized that his identity didn't need to be defined solely by trauma. He wasn't just someone who survived. He was someone who chose to act despite it. That night, on his way home, Daniel felt something rare. Exhaustion without guilt. A legitimate, deserved exhaustion. He knew the challenges weren't over. That emotional recovery was a long process. But for the first time since leaving the battlefield, he felt he was moving towards something, not running away. The climax didn't turn Daniel Walker into a hero. It turned him into someone whole enough to carry on. And for a war veteran who had long believed he was condemned to bear only losses, this was the greatest possible triumph. The conclusion of Daniel Walker's story didn't come with applause, headlines, or lasting public recognition. Like almost everything in the life of a war veteran, it happened quietly, discreetly, but profoundly. The small town in the American Midwest slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The same streets, the same cafes, the same restrained greetings. At first glance, it might seem that nothing had changed. But Daniel knew that some transformations aren't visible from the outside. In the days that followed the confrontation, Daniel felt the weight of exhaustion finally settle in. Not the nervous fatigue of war or constant hypervigilance, but an honest weariness, a consequence of having faced something to the end. As a war veteran, he had always associated rest with the temporary absence of danger. Now he was beginning to understand rest as something different, the absence of escape. His relationship with the city also changed, albeit subtly. Some people began to greet him with more respect, others with discomfort. Daniel Walker wasn't seeking unconditional acceptance. As a war veteran, he had learned that pleasing everyone was never a viable option. What mattered was something simpler, being able to walk the streets without feeling like he was hiding from himself. The woman he had helped began, little by little, to rebuild her life. Not because everything had been resolved, but because fear no longer dictated every decision. Daniel didn't position himself as the central figure in this change. He simply remained available, present, when needed. For a war veteran, learning to remain without control was one of the most difficult and most liberating lessons. There was a specific moment, weeks later, when Daniel Walker realized that something inside him had finally shifted. He was sitting on a park bench, watching the sunset, when he noticed his breathing was still. No internal alarm, no anticipation of threat, just the now. For a war veteran, this kind of inner silence is rare and precious. This didn't mean the trauma had disappeared. The memories remained. Certain sounds still immediately caught his attention. Some nights were still longer than others. But Daniel began to understand that healing isn't about erasure. It's about coexistence. It's about learning to carry the past without allowing it to determine every step of the present. The real turning point happened within him. Daniel Walker, a war veteran by identity and history, stopped seeing himself merely as a broken man trying to survive. He began to see himself as someone wounded, yes, but still whole enough to choose. To choose to stay, to choose to care, to choose to act when necessary, not out of obligation, but out of alignment with who he had always been, before and after the war. The ultimate moral of Daniel's journey wasn't in grand speeches about heroism. It was in something more human and true. Scars don't disqualify anyone. They tell stories, stories of resilience, of loss, of continuity. A war veteran isn't just someone who faced the worst in the world. It's someone who returns carrying that weight and yet tries to live with dignity. Daniel Walker stayed in that city. Not because it was perfect, but because there he had stopped running away. And that, for him, was the greatest victory. The battlefield was behind him, but the courage needed to live after it proved as great as any past confrontation. And so, without fanfare, without grand finales, the story concludes with a simple and powerful truth. Surviving war is an immense feat, but learning to live after it is the true act of bravery. If you've made it this far, it's because this story resonated with you on some level. Perhaps through silent pain, perhaps through contained strength, perhaps through the truth that often goes unnoticed when the subject is a war veteran. This channel exists precisely for that reason. To tell stories that go beyond the surface, that help to see people, choices and scars with greater depth. If this type of content resonates with you, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue receiving stories like this, always with purpose and meaning. If you want, leave a comment below with the phrase, "This story spoke to me." That way I know you stayed until the end. And it also helps this video reach more people who might need to hear something like this today. And if at any point during this journey you felt a connection with Daniel, with his story, or with what war leaves behind after the uniform is taken off, a like on the video is a natural way to show it. It strengthens the channel and allows this type of storytelling to continue being produced. There's a video over here that perfectly complements this theme, with another story that follows the same deep human line. Click on it, continue watching, and if you haven't subscribed yet, I invite you to join the channel.